The summer heat was oppressive that Saturday morning in rural Pennsylvania, the kind of thick, humid air that made every breath feel like work. Two brothers, Marcus and Daniel Reeves, wiped sweat from their foreheads as they pulled their weathered pickup truck into the gravel driveway of what had once been a prosperous farm. The paint-peeled farmhouse stood silent and abandoned, its windows dark and vacant, surrounded by overgrown fields that hadn't seen a plow in decades. A faded hand-painted sign near the road announced an estate sale, the letters barely legible against sun-bleached plywood. The brothers had developed a routine over the past 3 years, ever since Marcus had lost his factory job and Daniel's construction business had slowed to a trickle. They scoured estate sales, auctions, and barn cleanouts across 3 counties, searching for scrap metal they could sell to recycling centers for cash. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid enough to keep food on their tables and roofs over their families' heads during uncertain economic times. They had learned to spot value where others saw only rust and ruin, to recognize the difference between worthless junk and salvageable material that could be sold by the pound. Hey, before we dive deeper into this incredible discovery, we're incredibly close to hitting 7,000 subscribers on this channel, and we need your help to get there. If you're enjoying this story and want to see more amazing tales of hidden treasures and forgotten history, smash that subscribe button right now. And if you really want to support what we do here, consider sending us a super thanks. It helps us bring you even more incredible content like this. Also, drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community. Now, let's get back to what the Reeves brothers found in that barn. The estate sale was being conducted by a harried-looking woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Patricia. She explained that the property had belonged to her uncle, Harold Peterson, a reclusive widower who had passed away 3 months earlier at the age of 93. Harold had been a mechanic in his younger years, she said, and had accumulated an enormous collection of tools, parts, and machinery over 7 decades. Patricia seemed overwhelmed by the sheer volume of items crammed into the various outbuildings, and she admitted she had no idea what most of it was or what it might be worth. She just wanted it gone so she could sell the property. Marcus and Daniel spent the first hour methodically working through one of the smaller sheds, sorting through boxes of old hand tools, metal pipe fittings, and assorted hardware. They filled several plastic bins with copper wire, brass valves, and aluminum pieces, the bread and butter of their scrapping operation. The temperature inside the unventilated shed climbed past 90 degrees, and their shirts became soaked with perspiration as they worked. Other bargain hunters came and went, most of them taking smaller items like furniture, dishes, and old farm implements. Around mid-morning, Daniel suggested they check out the largest barn, a massive structure at the far end of the property that leaned slightly to one side, its red paint long since weathered to a dull gray. The barn doors were padlocked, and Patricia had to search through a coffee can full of keys before finding the right one. When she finally swung the heavy doors open, sunlight flooded into a cavernous space filled with shadows and dust motes dancing in the air. The smell hit them immediately. Decades of motor oil, rust, and decay mixed with the sweet scent of rotting hay. Inside the barn was a bewildering collection of automotive and mechanical debris. Rusted car bodies from the 1940s and 50s were stacked along one wall. Engine blocks of various sizes sat on wooden pallets, their metal surfaces covered in oxidation and grime. Transmission housings, drive shafts, and countless unidentifiable metal components filled every available space. It looked less like an organized collection and more like the aftermath of a mechanical apocalypse, a graveyard where machines came to be forgotten. The brothers began their usual assessment, calculating weights and metal compositions in their heads, determining what might be worth the effort of loading into their truck. Daniel was examining a stack of cast-iron engine blocks when Marcus called out from the far corner of the barn. His voice had an unusual quality to it, a mixture of confusion and curiosity that made Daniel look up immediately. Marcus had discovered something partially hidden beneath a disintegrating canvas tarp and several sheets of warped plywood. Only a small portion was visible, but what Daniel could see looked different from the typical automotive engines they usually encountered. The exposed section showed a circular arrangement of what appeared to be cylinder heads, radiating outward from a central hub like the spokes of a wheel. The metal was heavily corroded, covered in layers of rust, oil residue, and decades of accumulated grime. Together, they cleared away the covering materials, revealing more of the mysterious object. It was enormous, far larger than any car or truck engine they had ever seen. The circular configuration became more apparent as they removed the debris. It was a radial engine, the type used in aircraft, with cylinders arranged in a star pattern around a central crankcase. But even with their limited knowledge of aviation engines, the brothers could tell this was something exceptional. The sheer size of it was staggering, with massive cylinders that dwarfed anything from a typical aircraft. The engine sat on a homemade steel cradle, welded together from heavy I-beams that groaned under its weight. Decades of neglect had not been kind to the machine. Rust covered nearly every exposed surface, transforming once shiny aluminum and steel into rough, corroded patches of brown and orange. Oil had leaked from various seals and gaskets, creating dark stains on the concrete floor beneath it. Small animals had nested in some of the cavities between cylinders, and their dried droppings added to the general atmosphere of abandonment. Despite its decrepit condition, certain features remained visible beneath the decay. The engine had 2 rows of cylinders, one behind the other, making it a double-row radial configuration. Marcus counted the cylinders in the front row. There were 9 of them, each one the size of a large coffee can. The rear row, partially obscured by the front, also appeared to have 9 cylinders. 18 cylinders in total, which suggested this was a power plant designed for serious applications. Daniel found a nameplate partially hidden beneath rust on the crankcase. Using his pocket knife, he carefully scraped away decades of corrosion and grime. Letters began to emerge, stamped into the metal plate, Pratt and Whitney. Even with their limited aviation knowledge, both brothers recognized that name. Pratt and Whitney was one of the most prestigious aircraft engine manufacturers in history, known for building the power plants that had won World War II and powered the golden age of aviation. Their hearts began to beat faster as the implications slowly dawned on them. This wasn't just a pile of scrap metal. It might actually be something historically significant. But they forced themselves to remain calm and not show too much interest. In the world of estate sales and auctions, displaying enthusiasm was a guaranteed way to drive prices up. They had learned that lesson the hard way during their first year of scrapping. Marcus found Patricia and asked about the large engine in the barn corner as casually as he could manage. She shrugged and said she had no idea what it was or where her uncle had acquired it. As far as she knew, it had been sitting in that spot for as long as she could remember, probably 40 years or more. She seemed genuinely uninterested in the details, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of items she needed to dispose of. When Marcus asked what she wanted for it, she paused to consider, looking at the massive rusted hulk with obvious skepticism about its value. After a moment's thought, Patricia quoted them a price of $350. It was more than they typically spent on a single item, but given the massive amount of metal in the engine, easily 2,000 pounds or more, it would still be profitable as scrap even if it turned out to have no historical value. Marcus negotiated her down to $275, and they shook hands on the deal. Patricia seemed genuinely relieved to have one fewer item to worry about, and she helped them clear a path to get the engine out of the barn. The loading process proved to be a logistical nightmare. The engine was far too heavy to lift by hand, even with both brothers straining together. They ended up renting an engine hoist from a nearby tool rental shop, driving 40 minutes round trip to get it. By the time they returned, the afternoon sun had turned the barn into an oven. Working slowly and carefully, they positioned the hoist, secured chains around the engine's mounting points, and gradually lifted it free from its steel cradle. The hoist's wheels groaned under the weight, and for a terrifying moment they thought it might tip over, but eventually they managed to maneuver the engine out of the barn and into the bed of their truck. The truck's suspension compressed noticeably under the load, and Daniel worried about whether the vehicle could handle the weight for the 20-mile drive back to Marcus's property, where they had set up their workspace. They drove slowly, avoiding potholes and rough roads, the truck's engine laboring under the burden. Other drivers gave them strange looks at traffic lights, probably wondering what the enormous rusted mass in the truck bed was. Back at Marcus's place, they used the rented hoist again to transfer the engine into his workshop, a converted two-car garage where they stored and processed their scrap metal finds. They set it on a sturdy workbench reinforced with steel supports, then returned the hoist to the rental shop. That evening, exhausted and covered in grime, they finally had a chance to really examine their purchase under the bright LED work lights Marcus had installed. The more they looked at the engine, the more questions emerged. It was clearly a sophisticated piece of engineering, even beneath the corrosion and neglect. The castings were intricate, with cooling fins precisely formed on each cylinder head. The pushrods, valve springs, and rocker arms, all visible once they started carefully cleaning small sections, showed remarkable craftsmanship. This was not some crude industrial engine cobbled together from basic parts. This was precision aerospace engineering. Daniel pulled out his smartphone and began researching Pratt and Whitney radial engines. He discovered that the company had built dozens of different models over the decades, ranging from small engines producing a few hundred horsepower to massive power plants capable of generating thousands of horsepower. The 18-cylinder, two-row configuration narrowed the possibilities considerably. He found references to the R-2800 Double Wasp, one of the most successful aircraft engines ever built, which powered everything from fighters to bombers during World War II and beyond. But as he dug deeper into his research, Daniel discovered something that made his breath catch in his throat. Pratt and Whitney had also built a much larger, more powerful engine designated the R-4360 Wasp Major. This engine was legendary in aviation circles, a 28-cylinder monster that represented the absolute pinnacle of reciprocating aircraft engine development. The R-4360 was the most powerful piston engine ever mass-produced, capable of generating up to 3,500 horsepower in its most advanced variants, though most versions produced around 2,200 to 2,800 horsepower. The dimensions didn't quite match, however. Daniel counted the cylinders again carefully. Definitely 18, not 28. But something about the engine's overall size and architecture kept nagging at him. It was too large to be an R-2800, which typically had a diameter of about 52 inches. This engine appeared to be significantly larger, perhaps 60 inches or more in diameter, even accounting for the external accessories and housing. Marcus suggested they try to find a serial number or other identifying information. They spent the next 2 hours carefully cleaning sections of the crankcase with wire brushes, solvents, and patience. Their hands became black with dissolved grime and rust, and their backs ached from bending over the engine, but they persisted. Finally, on the lower rear section of the crankcase, Daniel found another data plate, this one more detailed than the simple manufacturer's nameplate they had found earlier. Using a combination of brass brushes and carburetor cleaner, they gradually revealed the stamped information. The letters and numbers emerged slowly from beneath the corrosion. R-4360-35. Below that was a serial number and a date code that indicated the engine had been manufactured in 1951. Daniel's hands actually shook as he photographed the data plate with his phone and began searching for information about this specific model. The search results made him sit down heavily on a nearby stool. The R-4360-35 was a late production variant of the legendary Wasp Major, rated at 2,200 horsepower. These engines had been used in some of the largest aircraft ever built, including the Convair B-36 Peacemaker intercontinental bomber, the Hughes H-4 Hercules Spruce Goose, and various large commercial aircraft. They were incredibly rare, with only a few thousand ever manufactured across all variants, and most of those had been scrapped decades ago as the aviation industry transitioned to jet engines. The monetary value of such an engine, even in its current deplorable condition, could be substantial if it could be authenticated and restored. But beyond the money, they had potentially discovered a significant piece of aviation history, a mechanical marvel that represented the absolute zenith of piston engine technology. The R-4360 Wasp Major was the engine that closed out an era, the final and most sophisticated expression of a technology that had powered flight since the Wright brothers. Over the following days, the brothers became obsessed with their find. They set aside their regular scrapping work and devoted every available hour to researching the engine and carefully cleaning it to assess its condition. Daniel joined several online forums dedicated to vintage aircraft and engines, posting photographs and asking for help with identification and valuation. The responses were swift and enthusiastic. Members of these communities immediately recognized the significance of their discovery. One forum member, a retired aerospace engineer named Walter Buchanan who had actually worked for Pratt and Whitney in the 1960s, offered to drive out from Connecticut to examine the engine in person. He arrived 3 days later, a spry 78-year-old with keen eyes and a lifetime of mechanical knowledge. Walter spent hours examining the engine, checking measurements, verifying the serial number against surviving company records he still had access to, and assessing the overall condition. His verdict was both exciting and sobering. The engine was absolutely authentic, a genuine R-4360-35 Wasp Major. The serial number indicated it had been part of a batch delivered to the United States Air Force in 1951, likely intended for the B-36 bomber program. However, the engine's condition was poor, not catastrophic, but definitely requiring extensive restoration work. The good news was that the core structure appeared to be intact, with no obvious catastrophic damage like cracks in the crankcase or major corrosion in the cylinder bores. Walter explained what the brothers had found in terms they could understand. The R-4360 represented a design philosophy that had been pushed to its absolute limits. To extract 2,200 horsepower from a reciprocating engine, Pratt and Whitney's engineers had created something almost impossibly complex. 28 cylinders arranged in 4 rows of 7 cylinders each, all driving a single crankshaft. The engineering challenges had been enormous. Managing heat distribution across 28 constantly exploding combustion chambers, ensuring adequate lubrication to hundreds of moving parts, coordinating the valve timing across all those cylinders. The engine weighed approximately 3,400 pounds dry, without oil, fuel, or accessories. It consumed aviation gasoline at a prodigious rate, burning through roughly 350 gallons per hour at full power. The propeller it drove could be 12 or even 13 feet in diameter, turning at carefully regulated speeds to convert all that raw power into thrust. Maintaining such an engine required specialized knowledge and careful attention. In operational service, they demanded extensive maintenance and inspection intervals that made them expensive to operate. Walter also shared stories from his time at Pratt and Whitney, working on the final years of piston engine development even as the company was transitioning to jet engines. He had never worked directly on the R-4360 program, but he had known engineers who had, and he had heard their stories of the incredible challenges they had faced. The Wasp Major had pushed materials science, machining tolerances, and engineering knowledge to their limits in the late 1940s. It was, in many ways, an engine that shouldn't have been possible given the technology of the era. But the R-4360's era had been brief. By the mid-1950s, jet engines were rapidly improving and proving their superiority for most applications. Jets were simpler, more reliable, and ultimately more powerful for their weight. The complex, maintenance-intensive piston engines of the R-4360's class became obsolete almost overnight. Most of them were scrapped, their valuable metal recycled for other purposes. Only a handful survived in museums or private collections. Walter estimated that fewer than 50 complete R-4360 engines still existed worldwide, and many of those were in museums or otherwise permanently preserved. The number of privately owned engines in restorable condition was probably less than 20. If the brothers chose to restore their engine to display quality, it could potentially be worth anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000, depending on the final condition and completeness. If they went further and made it airworthy, a significantly more expensive and time-consuming process requiring extensive machining and recertification, the value could be even higher. The brothers faced a decision that would shape the next phase of their lives. They could sell the engine as is to a collector or museum, probably netting somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000 based on current market conditions for project engines. That money would be life-changing for both families, providing financial cushioning they desperately needed. Or they could attempt a restoration, a process that would take years, require learning entirely new skills, and cost thousands of dollars in parts, materials, and specialized services. The potential payoff was much higher, but so were the risks. Marcus and Daniel talked for hours, weighing their options, discussing the realities of their situation. Marcus's wife Sarah was supportive but practical, pointing out they had 3 children to feed and a mortgage that was sometimes difficult to meet. Daniel's wife Jennifer was more encouraging, suggesting that sometimes opportunities like this only came once in a lifetime and deserved to be pursued, even if it meant short-term sacrifices. Ultimately, the decision wasn't really about money. Both brothers had felt something when they first uncovered that engine in Harold Peterson's barn, a connection to history, a sense of responsibility to preserve something significant. This engine had been built by skilled craftsmen nearly 75 years ago, during an era when American manufacturing was at its peak. It had likely powered aircraft that defended the nation during the Cold War. It represented engineering excellence and the pinnacle of a technological evolutionary path. To simply sell it off felt like a betrayal of something larger than themselves. They decided to attempt the restoration, but to approach it methodically and sustainably. They would continue their scrapping business to maintain their income, working on the engine during evenings and weekends. They would document everything, learning as they went, and building connections in the vintage aircraft community. Walter Buchanan agreed to serve as a consultant, offering guidance and access to his extensive library of technical manuals and documentation. The first phase of the project involved complete disassembly and assessment. Every bolt, every component, every seal needed to be removed, catalogued, cleaned, and evaluated. The brothers built a detailed inventory system, photographing each part, measuring critical dimensions, and researching original specifications. They discovered that Pratt and Whitney had produced incredibly detailed maintenance manuals for the R-4360, and copies of these documents were available through various vintage aircraft organizations. As they disassembled the engine over the following months, they gained profound respect for the engineers and machinists who had built it. The precision of the machining was remarkable, even after decades of corrosion. The crankshaft, when they finally extracted it from the crankcase, was a massive piece of forged steel weighing several hundred pounds, with perfectly balanced throws for all 4 rows of cylinders. The main bearings, though worn, showed the careful attention to detail that had gone into every aspect of the engine's design. They also discovered clues about the engine's history. Inside one of the accessory cases, they found a handwritten maintenance log entry dated July 1953, noting a propeller governor replacement at Carswell Air Force Base in Texas. This connected their engine to specific aircraft and specific moments in history. Further research revealed that Carswell had been home to the 7th Bombardment Wing, which operated B-36 Peacemakers during the early Cold War. Their engine had likely been part of America's nuclear deterrent force, flying long-range missions that helped keep the peace during tense years. The restoration process became an education in mid-century manufacturing techniques. Many of the parts required specialized machining that couldn't be replicated with modern computer-controlled equipment. The brothers connected with elderly machinists who still remembered working with manual lathes and mills, craftsmen who had learned their trade in an era when precision depended on human skill rather than computer programming. These men generously shared their knowledge, sometimes traveling to Marcus's workshop to demonstrate techniques that were slowly being forgotten. 18 months into the project, the engine was completely disassembled, with every component cleaned, catalogued, and assessed. The next phase, actual restoration and rebuilding, would be even more challenging. They needed to send the crankshaft out for magnafluxing to check for internal cracks, a process that cost $1,500. The cylinders needed to be rebored and honed, matching them to oversized pistons that had to be custom manufactured. The magnetos needed complete rebuilding by one of the few shops in the country that still had the expertise to work on aircraft ignition systems from this era. The costs mounted steadily, and there were moments when both brothers questioned their decision. A particularly difficult period came when they discovered that 6 of the 28 cylinders had significant internal corrosion that made them unsalvageable. Finding replacement cylinders for an R4360 proved nearly impossible. These parts simply weren't available through normal supply channels. Eventually, through their growing network of contacts in the vintage aircraft world, they located a parts dealer in Arizona who had 3 complete engine cores in his inventory. After lengthy negotiations, they purchased 6 cylinders for $8,000, a sum that required them to take on extra scrapping work for 3 months to afford. But there were also moments of pure joy and satisfaction. The day they finally reassembled the crankshaft and installed it back in the crankcase felt like a major victory. Watching the massive forged steel component lower into place, feeling the bearings seat properly, hearing the smooth rotation as they turned the shaft by hand, these were experiences that connected them directly to the craftsmen who had originally built the engine decades ago. Their obsession with the project attracted attention. Local news media heard about the restoration and produced a feature story that aired on regional television. Aviation enthusiasts began making pilgrimages to Marcus's workshop to see the engine in progress. The brothers started a YouTube channel documenting their work, and it slowly gained followers. People from around the world who appreciated seeing skilled hands bringing a piece of history back to life. 2.5 years after that hot summer day when they had first spotted the engine under a tarp in Harold Peterson's barn, the restoration reached a critical milestone. All major components were refurbished or replaced, and the time had come for reassembly. Following the precise procedures detailed in the original Pratt and Whitney maintenance manuals, they began the painstaking process of building the engine back up from its constituent parts. Each cylinder had to be torqued to exact specifications, following specific sequences to ensure even loading on the crankcase. The valve train required meticulous adjustment, setting clearances to within thousandths of an inch. The ignition system harness, with its dozens of specialized wires and connections, took a full week to install properly. The carburetor, a complex multi-throat unit that metered fuel to all 28 cylinders, was rebuilt by a specialist who had worked on similar units for vintage aircraft. Finally, on a cool morning in late October, the reassembled engine sat on its stand in Marcus's workshop, ready for its first test run in probably 50 years. They had no intention of actually starting it. That would require an elaborate test stand, extensive safety equipment, and various certifications they didn't have. But they could rotate the engine by hand, check for proper movement of all components, and verify that their restoration work had been executed correctly. Walter Buchanan was there, along with several other members of the vintage aircraft community who had helped them along the way. Using a special tool attached to the propeller shaft, they began slowly rotating the engine. The massive crankshaft turned smoothly, driving all 28 pistons up and down in their perfectly timed sequence. The valve train operated without binding, opening and closing the intake and exhaust valves in precise coordination. The complex dance of mechanical components that transformed fuel and air into raw power worked exactly as it had been designed to work 3/4 of a century ago. There were tears in Marcus's eyes as he watched the engine move through its cycles. This machine represented so much more than the sum of its parts. It was a testament to human ingenuity and craftsmanship. It was a connection to history, to the men who had designed it, built it, maintained it, and relied upon it during critical moments in history. It was proof that 2 working-class brothers from Pennsylvania, with no formal engineering training, could learn, adapt, and master skills that preserved something meaningful. The restored R4360 Wasp Major became a centerpiece at several aviation museums, displayed on temporary loan. The brothers received offers to purchase it, some exceeding $100,000, but they declined. The engine wasn't for sale. It represented something far more valuable than money. It represented their journey from desperate scrappers trying to make ends meet to recognized preservationists of aviation history. The publicity from their restoration led to other opportunities. Aviation museums began contacting them about other restoration projects. The brothers started a new business focused specifically on vintage aircraft engine restoration, building on the skills and contacts they had developed. Their financial situation stabilized and then improved significantly as they found their niche in a specialized market that valued their dedication and growing expertise. Marcus and Daniel often reflected on that summer morning when they had driven to Harold Peterson's estate sale, expecting just another day of sorting through scrap metal. They had been looking for a few $100s worth of salvageable material. Instead, they had found something that changed their lives, not because of its monetary value, though that was significant, but because it connected them to something larger than themselves, giving them purpose and direction during uncertain times. The story of their discovery spread through the aviation community and beyond, becoming an inspiration for others. It demonstrated that significant historical artifacts still existed in forgotten corners, waiting to be discovered by people willing to look past surface appearances. It showed that ordinary people with determination and willingness to learn could master complex technical challenges. Most importantly, it reminded people that history isn't just something in textbooks and museums. It's all around us, sometimes hidden under tarps in rural barns, waiting for someone to recognize its significance and give it new life. And now, as we reach the end of this incredible story, I want to remind you one more time, we're so close to 7,000 subscribers. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button right now. You've just spent time with us hearing this amazing story, and there are dozens more like it waiting to be told. Send us a super thanks if you can. It truly makes a difference in helping us create this content. Your support means everything to our small team. We read every comment, so let us know what you thought about the Reeves brothers' journey and what kind of stories you'd like to hear next. Until next time, keep your eyes open. You never know when you might stumble across a piece of history hiding in plain sight.